guys, Seth here again, another late night ties. Tonight we're tying up a scud pattern. Ever since I started tying, scuds have kind of been one of those things that I've really liked tie. I think that's kind of how it goes. It's when you get going tying, it kind of starts out as whatever works in your area is what you tie a lot of and what you enjoy tying. Kind of same goes here. There's a tailwater close to me. It's kind of where I really started my fly fishing, and it's kind of a scud tailwater, as a lot of tailwaters are. And so this is what's come to be my favorite scud fly to tie, and it's called a jelly bean scud. So without any further ado, let's get to it. All right, guys, so like I said, today we're tying up the jelly bean scud. This is a scud pattern that uses cog de leon fibers for the tail, ostrich roll for the body, and small copper wire for the rib. So to start off, I'll tie this tail in of cog de leon. Tie that in and run it down over the bend of my hook. This is a size 14 scud hook. I find that on these scuds, on a lot of flies, when it comes to tailwaters, they'll say that you got to go ultra small. And what I find on these scuds is when you're flipping rocks and looking through weeds, grabbing these scuds out, that yeah, there are a bunch of very small ones, but there are also a lot of pretty big ones as well. And as such, I've always had just as much luck fishing the big scuds as I have the small scuds. So I usually have some smaller ones in my fly box, just in case the fish are being picky, but for the most part, I get away with using these larger ones. So last material we'll be putting on this one is that peacock curl. Usually break the tip off just because it's so fragile. I'll tie it in. Alrighty. With this fly, I usually use the rotary function on my vise. Makes palmering this peacock curl a little bit easier. So I'll tie up to the front, throw in a half hitch, swing that bobbin cradle around, and just throw my bobbin on there. Alrighty. Now it can be the meticulous part. Palmering this peacock curl forward. You want to be careful and watch that tip of the point of the hook, because if it catches this delicate peak or ostrich hurl, it'll break it off and you'll be starting over. So we'll palmer it all the way up to the eye there. Once we're up there, swing that back around. and tie this guy off. A lot of people on this fly, it doesn't really matter what thread color you use. A lot of people on this fly will use an orange, kind of give their fly a little bit of a hot spot up by the head. What I find when the fish are picky enough that they're wanting these natural colors, they also can be picky enough that it seems like they don't like having that hot spot. So when I'm doing a natural color, I tend to just use a natural thread color as well. So I'll just use this light brown. So now, as you can see, the tying part of this fly is pretty much over with. I've whip finished and cut off my tying thread. And now you can use a little water or a little bit of DNA and brush all those those ostrich hurl fibers down, at which point we'll start what gives this fly its name as the jelly bean, and that is that we will be covering the back with a UV resin shell casing that almost makes it look like candy. So we'll take a drop on a bodkin, touch it to the back, and then just kind of spread it over the top, trying to keep it on top as best as possible. Kind of like that. I'll spin it upside down while I'm reaching for my light to keep it from dripping all across. And then I'll come in and we'll cure that resin. Now that that first layer of resin is on and cured, we will move on to that rib. And now what I like to do is I like to take my scissors and I'll open them just wide enough for that wire to be able to go in. And I'll kind of scrape along that wire down to the body, and any of these ostrich hurl fibers that we've caught, you can kind of brush them out so that you're not catching them and you're keeping as many legs on this fly open and fluttering as possible. The UV resin got away from me a little bit on this one, dripping onto your guys' side there, but I think it's going to work anyway. Now once we're at the eye, we'll give it a couple wraps around the eye there, spin it off. Alrighty, now we'll finish off the namesake of it and give it another coat of this UV resin over the back. Need a little bit more, so I'm going to spin that fly around so that it doesn't drip in a way I don't want it to. Get it just like that. And give it a cure. Alright, now that this one's done, we're going to go ahead and tie up another one. So like I was saying, these scuds have always been one of my favorite flies to tie. I think it just kind of comes down to whatever works in a person's area ends up being the flies that they kind of cut their teeth on in fly tying. For me is these scuds. My closest body of water to do any kind of blue ribbon trout fishing is a tailwater, and as such it's got a bunch of scuds as tailwaters do. So when I got started tying flies, I did what pretty much anybody does, I feel like, and that is I looked up what flies work on that river, and the answer was scuds. So I spent my early days of tying when I was 10, 11, 12, tying up a bunch of orange scuds. So much so that from my elementary school years of tying, I had so many orange scuds stocked up, I didn't have to tie another orange scud until I was out of college. I just had so many of them built up. It took all the way until I was out of college before I ran out of them. But a little bit has changed since then. Back then I was tying more of a traditional scud. You know, a dubbing body with a shell casing over the back, and then a rib, and then, you know, taking a brush of some sort and teasing out that dubbing. Back then, of course, I was a broke kid. I didn't have a allowance or anything like that, so it was birthday money pretty much was the only thing I was able to have for tying materials, and as such I had to improvise a lot. One of those things I would improvise was that scud back. Couldn't afford to go buy it, and so the material I'd improvise is I would just take Ziploc baggies, like sandwich baggies, and I would cut that into strips. And a lot of times I would just use clear, but then when I was getting fancy, I would sometimes take Sharpie and color in my Ziploc baggie whatever color I was wanting my scud back to be. And that was just kind of what I did as a kid. And then of course, once I became an adult and finally ran out of scuds to catch on the rocks at the bottom of the river, started tying scuds again. I was watching scud tying videos and found this gem, this, you know, jelly bean, and just thought, wow, that is just a gorgeous looking fly, which I just think this is one of the best looking flies, these jelly beans. Something about that resin back just looks nice to the fisherman. I don't know if it makes a difference to the fish. Obviously, it probably doesn't make a difference to the fish, but I like them. I think it's a great looking fly. And since then, this is the only way oh, look at that. That is my own fault for only going around that one time. So unfortunately for you guys, you gotta watch me palmer it forward again. Lost my train of thought. But anyway, this is how I like tying these guys now. Tie them in all sorts of colors, every scud color you can think of. I tie them in white, obviously. Tie them in a lot of dark grays. Tie them in a lot of dark greens, all the natural colors. On top of that, I'll also tie them in, your stereotypical scud colors, that being the bright pinks and the bright oranges. Of course, a lot of people argue that those bright orange and bright pink scuds are actually just imitating eggs. But what some people don't realize is that actually a scud is essentially a freshwater shrimp. And so just like a saltwater shrimp would, anytime you throw it in the frying pan, turn bright orange, scuds essentially do the same thing. Of course, not in a frying pan, but what I'm talking about is just when they die. You can do this for yourself. You can test it out. Next time you go to the river, take some scuds. Go reach down in the water, grab some scuds out of a clump of river grass. Take those scuds and throw them on top of the tube of your raft or onto a rock on the bank or anything. And about 30 minutes later, you go back and look at those guys. And they're going to be not as dramatic of an orange as, say, an orange one like this guy. But they are going to be, like a tan orange or a tan pink type of color. And so those orange scuds, although they aren't exactly natural, they're not exactly that far-fetched either. And so they can be a great color. But yeah, sometimes those fish, when they're looking for something a bit more natural, you pretty much have to stick to just the natural options. That being the greens, grays, browns, those colors. But these white ones also work phenomenal. Particularly in the extremely sunny days. For example, yesterday, my girlfriend and I went out fishing the tailwater by me here. And it was a tough day at the beginning. It was pretty tough. We were getting some eats, but they were pretty intermittent. We were running soft hackle sows and some of the more natural color scuds. We were rocking grays and greens. And we were getting eats, but it was pretty few and far between. And then I decided, it's sunny, so they might do a little bit better on a bright colored fly, just because a white scud fly might kind of flash in their eyes the way a natural one would when the light is kind of refracting off of its, appendages, as scuds are not fully, but at least slightly translucent in nature. And so I feel like that light can kind of flash through them on those bright days and look similar to what these white scuds do. And sure enough, I changed to white and it was lights out. It was just some pretty constant eats, and it really turned the day around. It took the day from being a really slow day to just fish every 10 to 15 minutes. But yeah, that can be kind of some of the importance of paying attention to what the elements are doing. I've had similar things happen when fishing Baetis patterns. You know, it'll be cloudy and I'll be throwing a black or a purple Baetis nymph, and they'll be eating them up, and then all of a sudden the sun comes up and you can't buy a bite, and then you switch to like a light green and boom, there they are right again. And so it only makes sense that lighter would work better with scuds as well. But yeah, that's kind of one of the big things I find with fly fishing is most of the time, especially on these tailwaters that have these high fish populations, you know the fish are there, and the fish have to eat to live, and so you know they're eating something. And so if you've been throwing flies at them for a long enough time and haven't gotten any eats in return, you know you gotta start thinking about changing things up. And that can save your day. But yeah, so that's the jelly bean scud tied in white. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you guys tie some up and try them for yourself on your local tailwaters. And there you go.